If your animal fur just looks weird or flat or off, this video is for you. I'm going to be covering some super common mistakes that a lot of artists are making when they're trying to paint realistic animal fur. Animal fur is a tricky subject. There's a lot going on. So these tips are going to help you to kind of simplify your process to make sure that with all of your paintings going forward, you are going to have much stronger and more beautiful, realistic animal fur. Now, I created the perfect guide for this video. It is called The Fur Fix, and it's completely free. If you want this guide that walks you through some of my favorite tips on how to actually paint more realistic animal fur with photos and everything, then grab that free guide in the description of this video. Mistake number one is blending everything into mush. Now, I think blending definitely has a big place in an art practice, but it's one of those tools that can be really, really easy to overdo. When you overblend your painting, you are going to be losing all of your texture and your form, which is a shame because those things are really important for creating a strong painting. Plus, you're just washing away all of your hard work, which nobody likes to do. When you overblend, everything is going to end up looking the same. So there's going to be no life and no realistic qualities in that fur. So how do we fix this? Well, you go about your blending of your fur a little more strategically. So you can save blending that fur out into areas where you actually want there to be a transition away from a focal point. So for instance, when people are looking at paintings of animals, or if they're just looking at any other living thing out there, subconsciously, the first thing we look at is the eyes and typically the center of the face. We connect with things emotionally through the eyes. So that's the first thing we tend to look at. So everything apart from that, you can start to blend it in different levels to be able to create a sort of shift into those lost edges and basically lock in that focal point where you want your viewer to be looking. So you can actually use a little bit more blending in your shadows or where the edge of your animal subject meets certain parts of your background. You can do more soft blending there to allow it to disappear and blend those lines into the background. And it's going to draw focus to where you want it. You'll also want to avoid doing a lot of really heavy blending where you do want people to be looking first. So around the eyes and the important parts like the center line of the face, or if there's certain parts of the animal's body that you want to be in focus more, don't blend those out too strongly. You want those to be a lot more sharp and harsh because that is going to create a tension and that's going to bring your viewer's eye right to those areas. Mistake number two is not painting fur in the right direction. I get it. Fur is complicated. You have this very complicated 3D structure of an animal. Not only is the fur a bunch of different lengths and textures, it's all going in different directions. And if you get the direction of that fur wrong, it's going to make a big difference. And your viewer might not be able to immediately say, oh, the fur on the shoulder of the animal is going in the wrong direction. But subconsciously, they're going to know something looks off. So the way that we fix this is we pay extra special attention to our reference photos. Or if you are painting from life, let's say you are painting your dog, zoom in nice and tight on your reference photos. And this is also why it's really important that you're choosing reference photos that are good quality. Because if you're trying to paint something that is really low resolution and blurry, you're not going to be able to have the data to tell you what direction that bird grows in. And yes, this is something that you start to pick up on intuitively the more you paint. But it's also kind of different for every animal. And it's one of those things that having a good quality reference photo can make all the difference for. So study the direction that the fur grows in. One of the trickiest areas is actually the center of the face and the eyes. So in certain areas, it might be a lot more intuitive. If you're looking at the tail of a wolf, the fur might be flowing down that shape. But if you're looking at the eye, the fur typically is going to be flowing away from the eye in a sort of radial pattern and not a consistent pattern either. And if you don't have that direction of fur correct, it's going to look pretty off. So mistake number 3 is using the same brushstrokes everywhere. So, like we just kind of talked about, animal fur has different lengths, different textures, different directions throughout the different parts of the animal. So, if you are using the exact same sort of brushstroke the entire time, you're not going to be able to actually paint any of those little nuances, and your fur is going to look wrong and flat and lifeless, and we don't want any of that. So, this is where learning to control your brushstrokes is really powerful because you can use different pressures. You can actually use different flicks, all of these different great things. There's different ways that you can even use one brush depending on how you're holding it. And learning all of these different things through experimenting is really, really powerful. You're going to want to use different pressures on your brush, different parts of your painting to get different textures of fur. You might want to even use a completely different brush for creating the fur on the face of your animal versus longer fur like on the tail. You also want to be paying attention to the shape of your brushstrokes. If you're making sure that every brushstroke is perfectly straight and orderly, that's not going to look very realistic either because animals and nature, it's chaos. They're not regularly brushing their hair and making it perfectly straight and orderly. No, that fur is messy. And if you are painting your fur to make it look super perfect, it's going to look odd. So, this is one that I typically find comes with more experience and comes through experimenting with your brushstrokes and playing. So rather than this being a stressful point of you feeling behind, take it as a license to play and experiment with different brushstrokes so that you can create more realistic fur. Mistake number 4 is skipping your underpainting. This one gives me a headache just thinking about it because I can't imagine going into a painting without starting with a strong underpainting because everything is just going to be so much harder for you. In your underpainting, you're focusing on building up a really solid painting through values and you're building up that 3D form. You're not worrying about texture, you're not worrying about detail, you're definitely not worrying about color yet. You're focusing on building up that realistic 3D form through your values. So if you're jumping right into detail without establishing a strong underpainting first, you're just setting yourself up for failure and frustration because your fur isn't going to have depth to it. It's not going to look lifelike. It's going to look like a bunch of little lines that are side by side and not going to look like realistic fur. So please do not skip the underpainting phase. It makes such a world of difference in your artwork. So, mistake number 5 is kind of following on the trails of the previous one. And this mistake is detailing too early. So, this is where you might be adding an underpainting and focusing on that, but you get a little too eager and you jump into details too soon. This might also result in you putting details in the wrong place and basically creating an accidental focal point in your artwork. And when somebody goes to look at your artwork in this case, they might not look at the right part of the painting first, which sounds kind of silly when you say it like that. But if you're painting a gorgeous portrait of your dog, you typically want the first thing that person to look at to be the eyes, because that's what we emotionally connect with. But if you have tons of detail in the shoulder of your dog, and that's the first thing the person looks at, it's going to be a little bit of a weird, disjointed viewing experience that isn't going to leave the viewer very satisfied. So, when you are building your painting, start with larger shapes first. Through that underpainting, you're building up your base before you add any texture. But even once you are starting to actually build up your realistic fur texture, you aren't jumping in with those teeny tiny brushstrokes right away. You want to build up your foundation first using bigger brushstrokes. And then as you start to progress through that detail layer, you're moving into smaller and smaller brushstrokes. You kind of want to think about detail in your painting as the icing on a cake, not the cake itself. Sure, icing on its own can be tasty, but it's not really a full experience. I personally like to save those smallest brushstrokes for very few select areas on my painting. Basically, what I deem to be the most important parts, usually the eyes, right around the eyes, center line of the face, and then everything else fades out a little bit more and you're using larger brush strokes, keeping all of that super tight detail right in those most important areas. All right, so that brings us to the end of this list of mistakes. Which one are you guilty of? I know I've definitely been guilty of all of them through different points in my artistic journey, which is why I love to share stuff like this for you, because if there's something that I can do to help you, I'm here for it. So let me know, which of these mistakes are you going to try and fix first in your own artwork? Before you go, don't forget to go download my free guide, The Fur Fix. It contains some of my favorite tips on how to paint more realistic animal fur. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.